Chapter 17 Manifest Destiny and Its Legacy, the American Pageant. Chapter Introduction. Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent, allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. John L. O'Sullivan, 1845. This quote is very important because one of the things that it does is it explains the reason for manifest destiny, which we'll define a little bit later. And this is, of course, is specifically because of the rise of our American population during this time. Territorial expansion dominated American diplomacy and politics in the 1840s. Settlers swarming into the still disputed Oregon country aggravated relations with Britain, which had staked its own claims in the Pacific Northwest. The clamor to annex Texas to the Union provoked bitter tension with Mexico, which continued to regard Texas as a Mexican province in revolt. And when Americans began casting the covetous eyes on America's northernmost province, the great prize of California, open warfare erupted between the United States and its southern neighbor. Victory over Mexico added vast new domains to the United States, but it also raised many thorny questions about the status of slavery in the newly acquired territories, questions that would be answered in the blood in the Civil War of the 1860s. Chapter 17 is significantly important to period 4 and 5 is because it leads us to the Civil War. One of the things that you want to make sure you understand about this paragraph is you need to know the issue with annexing Texas. Remember, 2 chapters ago, might have been 3, I believe it was actually 3 chapters in chapter 14. Actually, I take that back. It was chapter 13 when they discussed the annexation or the freedom of Texas in terms of the Texas Revolution and how that Texas would want to be annexed to part of the United States. This is, of course, going to cause the issue of the imbalance of slavery if it were to be annexed. So those are the main things you want to understand about the introduction. The Session of Tyler II, 17.1. A horde of hard Siderites descended upon Washington early in 1841, clamoring for the spoils of office. Newly elected President Harrison, bewildered by the uproar, was hounded to death by Whig spoilsmen. The real leaders of the Whig Party regarded Old Tippecanoe as little more than an impressive figurehead. Daniel Webster, as Secretary of State, and Henry Clay, the uncrowned king of the Whigs, and their ablest spokesman in the Senate, would grasp the helm. The aging general was finally forced to rebuke the overzealous Clay and politely remind him that he, William Henry Harrison, was President of the United States. So one thing you understand here is they refer to him as simply just a figurehead, right? And what this means that there was the impression that other Whig Party leaders were trying to assert their influence on him. Unluckily for Clay and Webster, their scheme soon hit a final snag. Before the new term had fairly started, Harrison contracted pneumonia, wearied by official functions and plagued by office seekers. The enfeebled old warrior died only 4 weeks in the White House, by far the shortest administration in American history, following by far the longest inaugural address. So remember, as stated, he was kind of a figurehead. Webster and Clay felt like they would have a lot of influence on him. Well, unfortunately, one of the things for them that would happen was that Harrison would have the shortest term in the White House because he would die of pneumonia. The Tyler II part of the Whig ticket, here through only a rhyme, now claimed the spotlight. What manner of man did the nation now find in a presidential chair? He was 6 feet tall, slender, blue-eyed, fair-haired with classical features and a high forehead. John Tyler was a Virginia gentleman of the old school, gracious and kindly, yet stubbornly attached to principle. He had earlier resigned from the Senate, quite necessarily, rather than accept the stateful instructions from the Virginia legislature. Still a lone wolf, he had forsaken the Jacksonian Democratic fold for that of the Whigs, largely because he could not stomach the dictatorial tactics of Jackson. Tyler has accused him of being a Democrat in Whig clothing, but this charge was only partially true. The Whig, like the Democrat, was something of a catch-all, and the accidental president belonged to the minority wing, which embraced a number of Jeffersonian state writers. Tyler had, in fact, been put on a ticket partly to attract the vote of the fringe group, many whom were influential Southern gentry. Yet Tyler, high-minded as he was, could never have consented to run a ticket. Although a dominant Clay Webster group had published no platform, every alert politician knew that the unpublished platform contained. And virtually every major issue, the obstinate Virginian was at odds with the majority of the adoptive Whig Party, which was pro-bank, pro-tariff, and pro-internal improvements. Tyler, too, ran with Tippecanoe, but there the harmony ended. As events turned out, President Harrison, the Whig, served only 4 weeks, whereas Tyler, the ex-Democrat, who was still largely Democrat at heart, served 204 weeks. So one of the things that you want to make sure that you understand is that the term Tyler too would represent that him just being the vice president, right? Tyler too, and of course it rhymes with Tippecanoe, and that's where William Henry Harrison, that's what he's known for, is Battle of Tippecanoe. What you want to understand about these last three paragraphs that we read here was that many of the Whigs considered him that of being a Democrat, right? They didn't see him as someone that was a Whig in terms of political policy. Remember, one of the things that the states here in the text that he was more of a state writer. While of course Henry Clay, remember he believed in the American system. So there was some disagreement there. But people did not expect him to actually become president. In fact, that there was word that he would just be vice president, specifically because he would go ahead and attract the Southern gentry in the election. Okay, so those are some of the important things that you want to understand. So looking at this one, we definitely did answer these two questions. What does the term figurehead mean? I answered that in the very first part, and as well as, yet Tyler should have never consented to run this ticket. Explain this quote from your text. And one of the reasons why, and we kind of just discussed that, is focus on what was his motives, what was his political platform. Okay. John Tyler, a president without a party. After their hard-won cider victory, the Whigs brought their not-so-secret platform out of Clay's waistcoat pocket. To the surprise of no one, it outlined a strongly nationalistic program. Financial reform came first. The Whig Congress hastened to pass a law ending the independent treasury system, and President Tyler, disarmingly agreeable, signed it. Clay next drove through Congress a bill for a fiscal bank, which would establish a Bank of the United States. So these two paragraphs are very important because it shows that although Tyler was president, Henry Clay was having a lot of influence in terms of the federal policy. Tyler's hostility to a centralized bank was notorious, and Clay, the great compromiser, would have done well to conciliate him. But the Kentuckian, robbed repeatedly of the president by lesser men, was in an imperious mood and riding for a fall. When the bank bill reached the presidential desk, Tyler flatly vetoed it on both practical and constitutional grounds. A drunken Bob gathered late at night near the White House and shouted insultingly, "Who's out for Clay? A bank, a blank. Down with the veto." The stunning Whig leaders tried once again, striving to pacify Clay's objections to a fiscal bank. They passed another bill providing for a fiscal corporation, with the president still unbendingly vetoed the offensive substitute. The Democrats were jubilant. They had been saved from another financial monster, only by pneumonia that had felled Harrison. So as stated, remember Tyler is, although he's a Whig, I mean he was once a Democrat before, and he's showing this by vetoing the bank. Whig extremists, seething with indignation, condemned Tyler as His Excellency, as an executive ass. Widely burned in effigy, he received numerous letters threatening him with death. A wave of influenza then sweeping the country was called Tyler Grip. To the delight of the Democrats, the stiff-necked Virginian was formally expelled from his party by a caucus of Whig congressmen in a serious attempt to impeach him. He was broached in the House of Representatives. His entire cabinet resigned in body except Secretary of State Webster, who was then in the midst of the delicate negotiations with England. This is evident here that he was not someone that was very well liked. The fact that they're calling him His Excellency, that's referring that he's accidentally the president, right? He shouldn't be the president. That no one expected William Henry Harrison to die of pneumonia. The term executive ass, of course, refers to him being the executive branch and just not being very well liked. So there are two examples right there that he is not too popular, and also the fact that you're going to get many people that from his cabinet that resign. The proposed Whig tariff also felt the prick of the president's well-inked pen. Tyler appreciated the necessity of bringing additional revenue to the Treasury. But old Democrat that he was, he looked with a frosty eye on the major tariff scheme of the Whigs because it provided, among other features, for distribution among the states of revenue from the scale of public lands in the West. Tyler could see no point squandering federal money when the federal treasury was not overflowing, and he again wielded an empathetic veto. Chas and Clayites redrafted their tariff bill. They chopped out the offensive dollar distribution scheme and pushed down the rates so that the moderate to about the moderately protected level of 1832, roughly 32% of durable goods. Tyler had no fondness for a protective tariff, but realized the need for additional revenue. He reluctantly signed the tariff of 1842. In subsequent months, the pressure of higher customs duties slackened as the country gradually edged its way out of depression. The Whig slogan, Harrison $2 a day, and roast beef was reduced by unhappy Democrats to 10 cents a day and bean soup. So a couple things you want to understand here is not only does he, he's a Democrat at heart. I mean, one of the things that he decides to do is, like I said, he rejected the bill to create a bank, a national bank again. And one of the things he's also looking to do is he goes ahead and he vetoes a tariff. However, back in 1832 or 1842, what he ends up doing is reluctantly signing a tariff. So it shows that he's having a lot of political struggle. So if we look at this question, discuss Tyler's role in the proposal of the new Bank of the United States. We kind of talked about that already. And what evidence can you give of Tyler's unpopularity? You could use the nicknames, and you could also discuss what happened with his cabinet. What did he do? Well, he vetoed the bank, right? Discuss Tyler's party affiliation. So, although he is a Whig, one of the things that we talked about is that he is his policies that he's passing or vetoing make him more of that of more of that of a Democrat. Yeah, very good. A war of two words with Britain. A war of words, sorry. A war of words with Britain, 17.3. Hatred of Britain during the 19th century came to a head periodically and had to be lanced by a treaty settlement or by war. The poison had sweared ominously by 1842. Anti-British passions were composed of many ingredients. At the bottom lay big red-coated memories of the two Anglo-American wars. In addition, the genteel pro-British Federalists had died out, eventually leading to the boisterous Jacksonian Democrats. British travelers sniffing with aristocratic noses at the crude scene wrote acidly of American tobacco, spitting, slave auctioneering, lynching, eye gouging, and other unsavory features of the rustic republic. Travel books penned by these critics, whose views were avidly read on both sides of the Atlantic, stirred up angry outbursts in America. The Land of Liberty, 1847. The British cartoon reflected the contemporaneous view of American culture, partisan politics, and diplomacy that was common in the early 19th century. Francis Trollope, 1780 to 1863. An English writer delusioned by the failure of the utopian society she had joined in Tennessee, wrote scathingly of the Americans in 1832. Other nations have been called thick-skinned, but the citizens of the Union have apparently no skins at all. They wince if a breeze blows over them unless it be tempered with adultation. But the literary fireworks did not end there. British magazines added to the fuel and flames when enlarging on travel books. They launched sneering attacks on Yankee shortcomings. American journals struck back with "You're another" arguments, thus touching off the Third War with England. Fortunately, the British-American War was fought with paper broadsides and only ink spilled. British authors, including Charles Dickens, entered away with gall-dipped pens, and they were being denied rich royalties by the absence of American copyright law. So one of the things you understand here is obviously you're getting a growing tension between Great Britain and as well as America, right? And a couple of reasons is, of course, a lot of the pro-British Federalists, a lot of them are getting older, and some of them are no longer politically active. Sprawling America with expensive canals to dig and railroads to build was borrowing a nation in the 19th century. Imperial Britain, with its overflowing coffers, was lending a nation. The well-held creditor never popular with a down at the heels debtor. In the phrase bloated British um, bondholder rolled bitterly from many his American tongue. When the Panic of 1837 broke out and several states defaulted on their bones, repudiated them openly, honest Englishmen assailed Yankee trickery. One of them, or a new stanza for an old song. So what these three paragraphs kind of discuss is, of course, this rising tension that you have going on with Great Britain. And let's read that poem. Yankee Doodle borrows cash, Yankee Doodle spends it, and when he snaps his fingers at the jolly flat simpleton who lends it. Troubles of a more dangerous came sore in a home in 1837, when the short-lived demonstration erupted in Canada. It was supported by such a small minority of Canadians that had never a real chance of success. Yet hundreds of hot-blooded Americans, hoping to strive a blow for freedom against the hereditary enemy, furnished military supplies or volunteered or armed service. The Washington um, regime tried earnestly through futility to uphold its weak neutrality regulations. But then again, as in this case, Texas, it could simply not enforce unpopular laws in the face of popular opposition. Provocative incident on the Canadian frontier brought passions to boil in 1837. An American steamer, the Carolina, was carrying supplies to insurgents across the swift Niagara River. It was finally attacked on New York by a determined British force, which set the vessel on fire. Lurid American illustrators showed that a flaming ship, laden with shrieking souls, plummeting over Niagara Falls. The craft is in fact short of a plunge, and only one American was killed. So one of the things that we want to understand here, as stated in the other two paragraphs, is you are getting just this rising tension between the New Englanders as well as the British. And this paragraph, of course, discusses the Carolina, which is an American steamer, which was on its way to the Niagara River, but the steamer, the Carolina, was actually attacked and set on fire, apparently by the British. The unlawful invasion of the American soil, a counter invasion of neutrality, had a learning aftermath. Washington's official lodged vigorous but ineffective protest. 3 years later, in the 1840s, the incident was dramatically revived in the state of New York. A Canadian named McLeod, after allegedly boasting in tavern in the Carolina Ray, was arrested and indicted for murder. The London Foreign Office regarded the Carolina Raiders as members of a sanctioned armed force and not as criminals, made clear that this execution would mean war. Fortunately, McLeod was freed after establishing an ally. It must have been all right, for it was good enough to convince a New York jury. The tension for a while eased, but snapped into taut again in 1841, when British officials in Bahamas offered asylum to 130 Virginia slaves who had rebelled and captured the American ship Creole. Britain had abolished slavery within its empire in 1833, raising southern fears that its Caribbean possessions would become Canada, like heavens for escaped slaves. So as what you could see here, you could just kind of just see the rising tension. You need to know what the Carolina was. Remember, it was that ship that was going across Niagara River, and what we end up getting here is we end up getting just some violence that exists between Great Britain and the United States, right? So let's go back to our questions. So all of these right here represent just examples of conflict that was causing tension between the 1830s and 1940s. You want to make sure that you understand what we mean by literary war. And if you go back to our reading right here, it's going to be that second paragraph, right? Sprawling America with expensive canals to dig roads is borrowing the nation in the 19th century, right? Imperial Britain, with its overflowing coffers, was a leading nation, right? And I believe that question, which one are we looking at? Sorry. The literary war Of course, this is one thing you want to understand is we are getting here. Literary fireworks not end there. British magazines added fuel flames when enlarging on travel books. They launched New York attacks on the Yankee shortcomings. So, one thing that we're getting here is specifically just a bunch of travel books, as well as cartoons that are criticizing the British, but as well as Americans, right? So think about it as more of a literary war that we're getting. The Carolina Creole, very important that you understand, and you will find that right here. And I talked about this. This is when an American steamer was carrying supplies to the insurgents across the shifted Niagara, right? This is during the time of what we're looking at with Canadian rebellion, right? So very good. It was finally attacked in New York by determined British force. So in other words, you're getting America. What they're doing is with the Carolina in terms of when the Canadians are small minorities rebelling against the British. Of course, the American steamer was carrying supplies to insurgents, right? And that was, of course, stopped. The Creole, right? Very important. What you understand is you'll find it right here, right? This was Virginia slaves who had rebelled and captured the American ship the Creole. Britain had abolished slavery within its 1833 empire, raising southern fears that its Caribbean possessions would become Canada. Like havens for escaped slaves. So, I mean, if I want you to consider this, if remember, there's a lot of slave tension at the time. The Fugitive Slave Act was something that was passed. Remember, if a slave were to go up north, it was a northern's responsibility to deliver that slave back, right, to the south. And so imagine just the controversy with this act. If you're getting slaves from Virginia that are seeking asylum in the Caribbean islands, that's in some ways limiting slavery. And of course, the South is not going to be too happy about that. An explosive controversy of the early 1840s involved the main boundary dispute. The St. Lawrence River is icebound several months of the year, as the British, remembering the War of 1812, well knew. They were determined, as a defensive precaution against the Yankees, to build a road westward from the seaport of Halifax to Quebec. But the proposed route ran through the disputed territory, claimed also by Maine, under the misleading peace treaty of 1783. Tough-knuckled lumberjacks from both Maine and Canada entered disputed no man's land of tall timbered Aroostook River Valley. Ugly fights flared up, and both sides summoned the local militia. The small-scale lumberjack clash, which was dubbed the Aroostook War, threatened to widen into a full-dressed shooting war. So, main thing you understand about the Aroostook War, the cause is just a disputed land, specifically between us as well as Canada, um, and tying back to the War of 1812, right? And this was just mostly just minor, I guess you could say, just disputes that were just more fights. But as time went on, there was a threat of a full-fledged war, I guess you could say, with weapons involved. As the crisis deepened in 1842, the London Foreign Office took an unusual step. It sent Washington a non-professional diplomat, the conciliatory financier Lord Ashburton, who had married a wealthy American woman. He speedily established cordial relations with Secretary Webster, who had recently been lionized during a visit to Britain. The two statements, this two statement, their nerves frayed by protracted negotiations in the heat of a Washington summer, finally agreed to a compromise on the main boundary. On the basis of a rough split difference arrangement, the Americans were to retain some 7,000 square miles and 12,000 square feet miles of wilderness in this dispute. The British got less land, but won the desired Halifax Quebec route. During negotiations, the Carolina affair, lingering since 1807, was patched by an exchange of diplomatic notes. So, as stated, one thing you want to understand here was, of course, Canada was at this point. Sorry, that's my father-in-law sending me a Facebook message. Um, so, as you're looking at the here, one of the things you want to understand is Looking at the main boundary settlement of 1842, remember this was a dispute between Great Britain as well as the United States, but of course Canada at this time. This area was controlled by the British, right? In exchange for a good amount of territory, of course, the Great Britain would be given a proposed trade route, which you'll see right over here, which was extremely beneficial to them. Okay. An overlooked bonus sneaked by in the small print of the same treaty. The British, in adjusting the U.S. Canadian boundary farther west, surrendered 6,500 square miles. The area was later to be known the priceless Sebi Iron Ore, Minnesota. So, very important. What you understand is looking at this is that the U.S. is expanding, they're obtaining more territory. So we did kind of just go over those causes. I would go more in depth, look back. You understand the Iraq War was a dispute of land, right? More specifically between Great Britain, right, and their Canadian territory, as well as United States and their territory in Maine. A couple of these effects as a result of this war, you want to make sure you mentioned specifically the territory that was acquired by the United States. Hint, Minnesota, right? Some parts of Minnesota, but as well as what was given up. 17.5. The Lone Star of Texas shines alone. During the uncertain 8 years since 1836, Texas had a less precarious existence. Mexico, refusing to recognize Texas independence, regarded the Lone Star Republic as a province in revolt, to be reconquered in the future. Mexican officials loudly threatened war if the American eagle should ever gather the fledgling republic under its protective wings. Sorry, I think it paused for a second. Um, I'm not sure what part it paused at, but as I was saying, just looking at this first paragraph, just remember going back to a couple chapters ago that Texas was able to gain their independence from Mexico. And what they're saying in this paragraph is that if Texas was to be annexed by the United States, Mexico would go ahead and agree to go to a full-out war with the United States. Right? That they were always considering of taking Texas back. Remember back in chapter 13 that Texas had American settlers that were going into the territory even when it was still part of Mexico. And one of the requirements was that, in general, one of the requirements was that those settlers, number one, did not have slavery, and they also convert to Catholicism. The Texans were forced to maintain a costly military establishment. Vastly outnumbered by their Mexican foe, they could not tell when he would strike again. Mexico actually did not make two half. They did make two half-hearted raids, though ineffectual, foreshadowed more fearsome efforts. Confronted with such perils, Texas was driven to open negotiations with Britain and France, in the hope of securing a defensive shield of a protectorate. In 1839-1840, the Texans concluded treaties with France, Holland, and Belgium. Britain was intensely interested in an independent Texas. Such a republic would check the southward surge of the American colossus, whose bulging biceps posed a constant threat to British nearby possessions in the New World. A puppet Texas dancing the strings pulled by Britain could be turned upon the Yankees. Subsequent clashes create a smokescreen diversion behind which foreign powers can make into Americas and challenge the insolent Monroe Doctrine. French schemers were likewise attracted by a hoary game of divide and conquer. These actions would result, they hoped, into the fragmentation and militarization of America. So a couple things that you want to understand here is in the second paragraph, the Texans were very much concerned that Mexico would go ahead and be able to take them over. So one of the things that they were opening up was negotiations with France and Great Britain in hopes that they would become a protectorate. I guess you could say they would still have their freedom, however, they would become a territory of France and Great Britain. In this third paragraph, it kind of expresses the United States' concern of a Texas that would be associated with Great Britain or France, specifically because this would then go ahead and challenge the ever so popular Monroe Doctrine that we discussed a few chapters ago, which means that now that you're getting these European states that are kind of showing their influence in the North American hemisphere. Dangers threatened from other foreign quarters. British abolitionists were busily intriguing for a foothold in Texas. If successful in freeing the few blacks there, they presumably would inflame the nearby slaves of the South. In addition, British merchants regarded Texas as a potentially important free trade area, an offset to the tariff wall of the United States. Britain manufacturers likewise perceived that those vast Texas plains constituted one of the great cotton producing areas of the future. An independent Texas would relieve British looms of their chronic dependence on American fiber, a supply that might be cut off in time by embargo or war. So this is once again, this paragraph is discussing just the threats of Britain influence if they were to acquire Texas. Not only would that go ahead and just it adds some fear to the southern states because you're getting British abolitionists, right? That are trying to free the slaves there, and there's fear that that type of enthusiasm momentum would then inflame the slaves of the South, right? Granting them freedom in the future. Another thing that we kind of just this paragraph is looking at is just the motives of Great Britain. Of course, there's tariffs that are going on, and British manufacturers kind of see putting a foothold in Texas as as a motivating component because of their economy. So if we go ahead and look at this, how did Mexico view Texas from 1836 to 1845? I discussed that. Go back in your first two paragraphs. Of course, one of those reasons being that they felt as if they would be able to reconquer Texas. Why was Britain interested in Texas? In regards to Texas, this is why each of the following was interested um, in this territory, right? These are three reasons why. We talked about this: merchants, manufacturers, and abolitionists, and also why these are all threats to the United States. And you will find this all specifically not there, I apologize, but right over here in that last 2, 3 paragraphs that we found. Okay. That being, of course, as stated, when you're looking at British abolitionists, um, they one of their goals was to, of course, free the slaves, but of course, this influence would spread to the southern states in America, and British merchants here um, was they were concerned about the tariff, right? Trade. If they were to acquire Texas, they would be able to go ahead and obtain some of those goods. British manufacturers perceived that Texas as a great cotton producing area, right? So, all in all, abolitionists looking to free the slaves and as well as free slaves, because remember, slavery is all over, is finished in Great Britain this time. Um, Merchants are looking to kind of find a way to go against that tariff that's been established during this time, and the manufacturers they perceive this as a place to be able to grow cotton. 17.6 The belated Texas nuptials. Partly because of the fears aroused by British schemers, Texas became a leading issue in the presidential campaign of 1844. The foes of expansion assailed annexation, while Southern hotheads cried, Texas or disunion. The pro expansion Democrats under James K. Polk finally triumphed over the Whigs under Henry Clay. The hardly perennial candidate, lame duck President Tyler, thereby interpreted the narrow Democratic victory with the dubious accuracy as a mandate to acquire Texas. Eager to crown his troubled administration with this splendid prize, Tyler deserves much of the credit for shepherding Texas into foothold. Many anti slavery Whigs feared that Texas in the Union would be red meat to nourish the lusty slave power. Aware of this opposition, Tyler despaired of securing the needed 2/3 vote for a treaty in the Senate. He therefore arranged for annexation by a joint resolution. This resolution required only simple majority in both the Houses of Congress. After a spirited debate, the resolution passed in early 1845, and Texas was formally invited to become the 28th star on the American flag. So, a couple things you want to make sure that you understand here is they refer to Tyler as a lame duck president, meaning that he knew that his term was going to end, and him being a lame duck, meaning that he doesn't necessarily have that much power to really make much change or really to do much. But one of the things that he does do is he goes ahead, and it's against. Remember, he's a Whig. He ran as a Whig, right? He goes ahead and he uh, tries to annex Texas, right? And one of the things that we're looking at here is the Whigs were against this, right? He was against this specifically because there was fear, of course, with the imbalance and expansion of slavery, right? What I mean by imbalance is that of course, in terms of Congress, this is going to shift power more to the slave states, right? Um, so one of the things that he does is he tries to go ahead and add Texas to the Union. Um, he is not necessarily, I mean, he's not successful with this until a resolution is later passed in Congress, right? Um, yeah, so let's continue on. Mexico angrily charged that Americans had despoiled it of Texas. There was truth to this claim, especially in 1836 when the Texans first seceded, but considerably less so in 1845 when the area was no longer Mexico's to be despoiled of. But then the situation became even more complex. More than a decade of widespread Comanche raids had further demonstrated the weakness of Mexican influence in the region. As the years stretched out, realistic observers could see that Mexico could not be able to reconquer its lost province. The most astute observers could further see victory in war against Mexico would not resolve all tensions. A powerful integrated network of Comanche tribes still had to be reckoned with. By 1845, the Lone Star Republic had become a danger spot, invading foreign intrigue that menaced American people. The continued existence of Texas as an independent nation threatened to involve the United States in a series of ruinous wars, both in America and Europe. Americans were in a lick all creation mood when they sang Uncle Sam's song to Miss Texas. In Mexi, backed by secret foes, so talks of getting you gal, why we can lick 'em all, you know, and then annex them to gal. What other power would have spurned the imperial domain of Texas? That bride so near, so rich, so fierce, so willing, so fair, so willing. Whatever the peculiar circumstances of the Texas Revolution, the United States can hardly be accused of unseemingly haste in achieving annexation. 9 long years were surely to set wait between the beginning of the courtship and consumption of the marriage. Um, so one of the things that you want to understand in these last three paragraphs is just some of the issues that are going on with Mexico in regards to the annexation of Texas. Remember, going back to this paragraph at first, one of the issues was many anti-slavery Whigs feared that Texas Union would be red meat to the Norse lusty slave power, meaning that slavery is going to spread, right? Remember, we had the Missouri Compromise at this point that said that anything south of the 3630 line would be a slave state. But another thing that we're getting here is, of course, by annexing Texas, we're angering Mexico. As stated in the previous section, Mexico kind of looks to kind of annex, or they look to regain Mexico back. And it says even here, the situation become more complex. More than a decade of widespread Comanche raids had further demonstrated the weakness of influence in the region. Right, as the years stretched out, readers could see that Mexico would not be able to reconquer its lost province. Right, so that's a major concern that we're seeing here at this time. Right, so let's go back to our questions here. Why did some hesitate to annex Texas? Why was it finally admitted to the Union? I'd go back. You want to make sure you're specific, but big picture, one thing you'll understand is there's fear of the spread of slavery from the Whigs, as well as just one of the things that we fear is just kind of conflict with Mexico, right? They look to be able to obtain this back, to obtain the territory back. But it's clear that they would not be successful in doing so. 17.7 Oregon fever populates Oregon. A so-called Oregon country was an enormous wilderness. It sprawled magnificently west of the Rockies to the Pacific Ocean and north of Carolina to the line of 5440, the present southern tip of the Alaska Panhandle. All or substantial parts of this immense area were claimed at one time or another by four nations: Spain, Russia, Britain, and the United States. Um, Two claimants dropped out of the scramble. Spain, though the first to raise its banner in Oregon, bartered away its claims to the United States in the so-called Florida Treaty of 1819. Russia retreated to the line of 5440 by treaties of 1824 and 1825 with American Britain. These two remaining rivals now had to field themselves. So overall, these first two paragraphs are kind of just discussing that the Oregon country. I mean, it was vast. You're looking at just it was. I mean, it was magnificent. It was large, right? And earlier in the century, going back to period four, as well as period three, Spain, Russia, and Britain, the United States were all fighting for this territory. But looking at the certain treaties that we passed in period four, this would leave Great Britain and the United States kind of just uh, disputing over this territory. British claims to Oregon were strong, at least to that proportion north of the Columbia River. They were based squarely on prior discovery and exploration, on treaty rights, and on actual occupation. The most important colonizing agency was the far-flung Hudson's Bay Company, which was trading profitably with the Indians of the Pacific Northwest for the furs. So all in all, in that paragraph, they're saying that up in the Northwest region, the British were engaged in a lot of trade, right? More specifically, furs. Americans, for their part, could also point pridefully to exploration and occupation. Captain Robert Gray, in 1792, had stumbled upon the majestic Columbia River, which he named after his ship, and the famed Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 to 1806 had ranged overland to the Oregon country of the Pacific. This shaky American toehold was ultimately strengthened by the presence of missionaries and other settlers, a sprinkling of whom reached the grassy Willamette River Valley south of the Columbia in the 1830s. These men and women of God, in saving the soul of the Indian, were instrumental in saving the soil of Oregon for the United States. They stimulated interest in a faraway domain that countless Americans had earlier assumed would not be settled for countries. So, compared to Great Britain, they've established the Hudson Bay colony, trading fur. On the other hand, what you're getting with America is, of course, you're getting exploration of Lewis and Clark in 1804 to 1806, but you're also getting missionaries in this region that are looking to, of course, spread their Christian faith. Okay. Scattered American and British pioneers in Oregon continued to live peacefully side by side. At the time of negotiating the Anglo-American Convention of 1818, which we've talked about in period 4, the United States had sought to divide the vast domain in a 49th parallel, but the British, who regarded Columbia River as the St. Lawrence of the West, were unwilling to yield its vital artery. A scheme for peaceful joint occupation was therefore upon adopted, pending future settlement. So, with the Anglo-American Convention of 1818, what the Great Britain and the United States basically agreed was this would be joint occupation, meaning they could both stay in this territory together peacefully. The handful of Americans in the Willamette Valley was suddenly multiplied in the early 1840s when Oregon fever seized hundreds of restless pioneers. In increasing numbers, their creaking-covered wagons jolted over by 2,000-mile Oregon Trail as the human rivulet widened into a stream. By 1846, about 5,000 Americans had settled south of the Columbia River, some of them tough border ruffians, expert with bowie knife and revolving pistol. So one of the things they're saying here is, although we had a joint occupation previous paragraph, in the 1840s, we're going to get an abundance of American settlers moving west. The British, in the face of the rising torrent of humanity, could muster only 700 or so subjects north of Columbia, losing out lopsidedly in the population race. They were beginning to see the wisdom of arriving at a peaceful settlement before engulfed by their neighbors. A curious fact is that only a relatively small segment of the Oregon country was in actual controversy by 1845. This area in dispute consisted of a rough quadrangle between the Columbia River in the south and east, the 49th parallel in the north, and the Pacific Ocean in the west. Britain had repeatedly offered a line of Columbia. American had repeatedly offered the 49th parallel. The whole fateful issue was now tossed into the presidential election of 1844, which was largely overshadowed by the question of annexing Texas. So overall, one of the things that you want to see is Great Britain is obviously sees that they're outpopulated. They don't want to deal with any issues. So there's a whole bunch of negotiations going on in terms of territory of the Oregon country. But as stated in this end of the paragraph, this was very much overshadowed in the election of 1844 by the annexation of Texas. Okay. So we want to head. What change with Oregon from 1819 to 1844 caused British to become more willing to negotiate a final boundary? Well, that would be population. A mandate for manifest destiny, 17.8. The two major parties nominated their presidential standard bearers in May of 1844. Ambitious but often frustrated Henry Clay, easily the most popular man in the country, was enthusiastically chosen by the Whigs of Baltimore. Not a surprise. The Democrats, meeting there later, seemed hopelessly deadlocked. Van Buren's opposition to annexing Texas ensured his defeat, given domination of the party by Southern expansionists. Finally, party delegates trotted out and nominated Polk of Tennessee, America's first dark horse or surprise presidential candidate. So one things that we want to understand here, Henry Clay, we've been talking about this man for about a month. He's running for office again. He has his eyes on the prize, but obviously he is not victorious. The Democrats, one of the things that, they could go ahead and pick Van Buren. Again, he's a popular guy. He was president prior. But the thing is, he does not want to annex Texas, and they know for a fact that Southern expansionists are not going to be happy about this. So we get Polk to run for office. Polk may have been a dark horse, but he was hardly an unknown, decrepit nag. Speaker of the House of Representatives for 4 years and governor of Tennessee for 2 terms, he was determined, industrious, ruthless, and intelligent public servant. Sponsored by Andrew Jackson, his friend and neighbor, he was rather implausibly touted by Democrats as yet another young hickory. The Whigs attempted to jeer him into oblivion with the taunt, "Who is James Polk?" They soon found out. The campaign of 1844, in part an expression of the mighty emotional upsurge known as manifest destiny. Countless citizens in 1840s and 1850s, feeling a sense of mission, believed that Almighty God had manifestly destined the American people for a hemispheric career. They would irresistibly spread their uplifting, involving democratic institutions over at least an entire continent and possibly over South America as well. Land, greed, and ideals, empire, and liberty were thus conveniently conjoined. You need to know this term manifest destiny. That's probably the most important term of this chapter. That's why it's called manifest destiny. That's what this chapter is. What this means is that we have the divine right to move westward and expand. Expansionist Democrats were strongly swayed by an intoxicating spell of manifest destiny. They came out flat-footedly in their platform for the reannexation of Texas and the reoccupation of Oregon, all the way to 5440. While bellowing the Whig log cabinets in a game of slogans, they shouted, all of Oregon or none. The slogan, 54 or 50, sorry, I'm tired, guys. 5440 or fight was not coined until 2 years later in 1846. They also condemned Clay as a corrupt bargainer, a dissolute character, and a slave owner. Their own candidate Polk also enslaved, a classic case of the pot calling the kettle black. So a couple things you understand here is, of course, the Democrats under Polk, they're running for manifest destiny. They want to expand westward, and they're very much criticizing Henry Clay. Once again, the corrupt bargain is coming up. They're looking at his character. Yeah. So let's move on forward. Make sure you look at these cartoons. To Whigs, as noisemakers, took no backseat. They countered with such slogans as "Hooray for Clay" and "Polk, Slavery in Texas," or "Clay, Union and Liberty." They also spread the lie that a gang of Tennessee slaves had been seen on their way to a southern market branded with initials JKP, James K. Polk. So one of the things that we understand here is they're criticizing Clay as obviously, or my bad, is Polk as someone that's advocating for slavery, looking to expand to Texas. These are all issues that are going to rise to sectionalism. So that's what the Clay supporters are saying. Is Clay will kind of, when they're saying here union and liberty, they're restoring union and they're making sure they're keeping the union safe, meaning that sectionalism is not going to increase and that liberty will continue and thrive as a result of not adding Texas, because adding Texas means you're also going to most likely add a slave state. On the crucial issue of Texas, the acrobatic Clay tried to ride 2 horses at once. The great compromiser appears to have compromised away the presidency when he wrote a series of confusing letters. They seem to say that while he personally favored annexing slaveholding Texas, an appeal to the South, he also favored postponement as an appeal to the North. He might have lost more ground if he had not straddled, but he certainly alienated the more adherent anti-slaverites. So they're saying that he's kind of talking on both ends of his mouth. He's saying he favors annexing Texas, but he's also saying hey, let's do that later, way later. In the stretch drive, Dark Horse Polk nipped Henry Clay at the wire, 170 to 105 votes in the Electoral College, and 1.3 million. Or yeah, I mean, you have the numbers there in the popular column. Clay would have won if he had not lost New York by scant 5,000 votes. There, the tiny anti-slavery Liberty Party absorbed nearly 16,000 votes, many of which would otherwise have gone to the unlucky Kentuckian. Ironically, the anti-Texas Liberty Party, by spoiling Clay's chances and helping to ensure the election of pro-Texas Polk, hastened the annexation of Texas. Land-hungry Democrats, flushed with victory, proclaimed that they had never received a mandate from voters to take Texas. But a presidential election is seldom, if ever, a clear-cut mandate on anything. The only way to secure a true reflection of the voters' will is to hold a special election on a given issue. The picture that emerged in 1844 was not one of a mandate, but of a muddle. What else could there have been when the results were so close, the personalities so colorful, when issues so numerous, including Oregon, Texas, the tariff, slavery, the bank, and internal improvements? Yet this unclear mandate was interpreted by President Tyler as a clear crystal charge to annex Texas, and he signed a joint resolution 3 days before leaving the White House. So one thing that we're looking at here is, although Polk wins the election, um, and this paragraph discusses it. One thing we want to understand was that it was not clear that it was actually going to happen, right? And that's typically what happens in elections. You will elect a president, but until that president's in power, nothing is for certain until they actually go ahead and, I mean, something passes through Congress or they sign an executive order, one or the other. But in this case, what we're getting is before he leaves the White House, President Tyler goes ahead and through a joint resolution with Congress, he goes ahead and annexes Texas. Very controversial. So Man of Fate Destiny, what were the arguments for the expansionist Democrats in the election of 1844? So what I would do is use that definition of manifest destiny to explain that. What were the arguments of the Whigs in the election of 1844? I would kind of discuss Henry Clay's platform. What role did the Liberty Party play in the election of 1844? You want to discuss about the results of New York State. Okay. Polk the Purposeful. We're going to stop it right there for right now. We'll continue with video 2.